On October 3, 2014, 18-year-old Paige Rowland was kneeling in the cereal aisle of an Asda supermarket in Scotland, restocking shelves. Without warning, a stranger raised a wine bottle and smashed it onto the back of her skull. Paige collapsed unconscious as blood poured from her head. Security cameras captured everything, showing the attacker calmly walking away after the single blow. The man had traveled over 400 miles from England to find her, and the reason is insane. This is the story of Richard Brittain, the quiz show champion who became a violent criminal over a bad review. To understand how Richard Brittain went from being a celebrated television personality to a violent criminal, we need to rewind back to 2006 when Richard was just 20 years old. At the time, he was actually famous for something good. He had just won Series 55 at Countdown, which is a popular British quiz show that tests contestants on their mathematical abilities and word knowledge.
Difficult, but it means that Richard Brittain, aged 19, our number 2 seed, is through to tomorrow's final, ladies and gentlemen. That's Richard. Well played. Well done, Matt.
Richard was brilliant at solving the puzzles and impressed everyone with his intelligence. His success didn't stop there either. Just a few months later, in January 2007, Richard won another quiz show called Brain Teaser on Channel 5, taking home a cash prize of 1,500 British pounds. People who watched these shows saw Richard as a smart, talented young man with a bright future ahead of him. He was known for his exceptional mathematical skills and his vast general knowledge. But what the television cameras didn't show was the darkness that was growing inside Richard's mind. Richard had been struggling with paranoid schizophrenia, a serious mental health condition that his lawyer claimed he had. Instead of seeking proper treatment and help for his condition, Richard decided to channel his energy into something else. He decided to become an author. By the time Richard was 28 years old in 2014, he was living in Bedford, England, and he had self-published a fantasy novel called The World Rose. But there was something deeply wrong with this book, and Richard's obsession with it would eventually lead him down a path that would destroy multiple lives, including his own. Richard described The World Rose as an epic fairy tale romance set in a semi-fictional ancient world. The story featured a princess character named Ella Tundra, and if you're wondering where Richard came up with that name, the answer is truly disturbing. Richard later admitted that the book was based on a real woman he'd been stalking. He even described the book as the work of a schizophrenic at the fullest extent of his fantasy. This should have been a massive red flag to everyone around him, but Richard went ahead and published the book anyway. Before officially self-publishing The World Rose, Richard posted the manuscript on a website called Wattpad, which is a platform where amateur writers can share their work and receive feedback from readers. Richard wanted to know what people thought of his book, but there was a problem. Richard couldn't handle criticism. Whenever someone left a comment pointing out flaws in his writing or saying they didn't enjoy the story, Richard would completely lose his temper. He would send threatening messages to the reviewers, harass them online, and make their lives miserable. Richard became so notorious on Wattpad for his behavior that other users started warning each other about him. People would write things like, "Be careful if you review this book because Mr. Brittain is known for threatening users who don't praise him." But Richard didn't care about these warnings. In his mind, his book was a masterpiece, and anyone who criticized it was an enemy who deserved to be punished. Richard also wrote other books, including titles like Boondoggle and The Chocolate Hologram, but The World Rose was the one he was most obsessed with. Today, if you look up The World Rose on websites like Goodreads and Amazon, you'll find that it has predominantly one-star reviews. People criticize the writing, mock the story, and many of them reference Richard's violent attacks as a warning to other readers. But back in 2014, there was one particular reviewer whose negative comments would set off a chain of events that nobody could have predicted. Paige Rowland was just a teenage girl from Scotland who enjoyed reading books online. She came across Richard Brittain's novel, The World Rose, on Wattpad and decided to give it a try. Unfortunately for Richard, Paige did not enjoy the book at all. She thought the cover looked amateurish and unprofessional. She found the writing to be repetitive and poorly written. She even noticed that Richard overused the word suddenly throughout the story, which made the book feel clumsy and unpolished. So Paige did what any honest reader would do. She left a review explaining her thoughts. But Paige also included something else in a review, a warning to other readers. She wrote, "Mr. Brittain has gained a bit of infamy on Wattpad, where he's known for threatening users who don't praise him. Pray for me." Paige probably thought she was just being funny with that last part, but she had no idea how serious the situation was about to become. It's important to note that Paige hadn't even read the full published version of the book. She had only read an excerpt that Richard posted on Wattpad, but even that small portion was enough to make Paige realize that the book was not well written. She felt obligated to share her honest opinion with other readers. When Richard saw Paige's review, he became absolutely furious. He couldn't believe that this random teenager from Scotland had the audacity to criticize his work and warn others about his behavior. In Richard's twisted mind, Paige had committed an unforgivable offense, and he decided that she needed to pay for what she had done. But before we get to what Richard did to Paige, you need to know about the other woman Richard had been tormenting for years, because her story reveals just how dangerous Richard truly was. Her name was Ella Durant. She was a 23-year-old university student at the university in Greenwich in London. Ella worked part-time at the student union bar, and that's where she met Richard Britton. Richard asked her to join his University Challenge team, a British quiz competition for college students, and Ella agreed. Richard started showing up at the bar during Ella's shifts. He'd figured out her work schedule and would frequent the bar when she was working. Ella became increasingly uncomfortable and told him he was freaking her out and being far too forward, but Richard declared he was infatuated and in love with her. Ella blocked Richard on social media and reported him to the university authorities, who made Britton sign a contract saying he would stop harassing her. Desperate to escape him, Ella moved from London all the way to Glasgow, Scotland, just to get away from Richard. But Richard obtained Ella's new address from a University Challenge application form and sent her a Valentine's card to her new Glasgow address. In June 2014, Ella spotted Richard on Buchanan Street in Glasgow. She fled immediately and called the police. 2 days later, Richard found her again on Kilmarnock Road, and she screamed for help when he approached her. As creepy as it all sounds, Richard went one step ahead and asked if she would like to be kidnapped as part of a plan to make them both famous. Richard had developed an elaborate fantasy about staging a fake kidnapping for media attention, somehow believing this would make Ella fall in love with him. He said, "We would go into the hills and camp out for a few days while the nation searched." But on September 23, 2014, just days before he would attack Paige Rowland, Richard published a blog post that revealed the true extent of his madness. Richard titled his blog post The Benevolent Stalker, and in it, he detailed every single thing he had done to Ella Durant over the past few years. The blog had a subtitle that read, "Musings from the Author and Countdown Champion," as if Richard was proud of what he was about to confess. In the post, Richard admitted that he knew he was stalking Ella, and that he knew he was frightening her. But Richard claimed that his stalking was different from that of other stalkers, because his intentions were benevolent. Richard actually tried to distinguish between what he called benevolent stalking and malevolent stalking. He argued that benevolent stalking was when you followed someone around to induce affection rather than to harm them. In Richard's deluded mind, he genuinely believed that if he kept showing up in Ella's life, kept following her from city to city, and kept tracking down her new addresses, she would eventually realized that they were meant to be together. In the blog post, he wrote about how he had tracked her movements, figured out her work schedule, followed her to a new city over 400 miles away, and refused to leave her alone no matter how many times she told him to stop. The blog post went viral almost immediately, and people on the internet were absolutely horrified by what they read. The widespread condemnation was swift and severe. People called Richard a dangerous predator, a monster, and a threat to society. The backlash was so intense that a few days later, Richard posted an apology on his blog. He wrote, "I now recognize that my behavior was vile, selfish, and deluded. An article about me was entitled, 'Inside the Mind of a Stalker.' I believe that I may, in some small way, be able to add to an understanding of the problem." He even wrote follow-up posts about his re-evaluation of romance and stalking, and for a brief moment, it seemed like maybe Richard had finally realized how wrong his actions were. But that apology meant absolutely nothing, because just days after posting it, Richard got into his car and began a journey that would end with him committing a violent crime and land him in prison. Richard hadn't forgotten about Paige Rowland's negative review of his book. In fact, he had become obsessed with punishing her for it. He went online and found Paige's negative review, and then he used Facebook to track her down. Through her social media profile, Richard discovered what town she lived in and where she worked. He learned that Paige was employed at an Asda supermarket in Glenrothes, Scotland. Cell phone records would later show that Richard traveled approximately 400 to 500 miles from his home in Bedford, England, to Glenrothes, Scotland. The records also showed that he made stops in North Berwick before eventually returning to London. This wasn't a spontaneous trip or random coincidence. This was a carefully planned attack, and Richard knew exactly what he was going to do when he got there. When Richard arrived at the Asda supermarket, he waited for Paige's shift to begin. Then he walked into the store and went straight to the alcohol aisle, where he selected a full bottle of wine. But Richard wasn't buying the wine to drink it. He was buying it to use it as a weapon. With a bottle in hand, Richard walked through the store until he found Paige. She was kneeling down in the cereal aisle, completely focused on restocking the bottom shelf with boxes. Paige had no idea who Richard Britton was. She had no idea that the man who had threatened people online for leaving bad reviews was now standing directly behind her. Richard raised the wine bottle high above his head and brought it down with all his strength, striking Paige on the back of her skull. The attack was brutal, premeditated, and there was no provocation or warning given. Richard simply attacked her and then calmly walked away, leaving Paige unconscious and bleeding on the supermarket floor. Paige was rushed to the hospital where doctors worked to treat her severe head wound. She required multiple stitches to close the gash on her skull, and she would later testify in court that if Richard had struck her just a little bit harder, she could have died. The physical injury was terrible enough, but the psychological trauma was even worse. Paige now lives in constant fear that Richard will track her down again. She moved to a secret address and suffers from ongoing anxiety whenever she has to be in public spaces. The original post that Paige had made on Wattpad and Tumblr about the attack were eventually deleted, but the memory of what happened to her will never go away. When the time came for Richard's sentencing, Paige traveled to the court to face him. After the verdict was announced, she told reporters that the outcome was definitely worth it. But the truth is that Paige will be dealing with the consequences of Richard's attack for the rest of her life. Ella Durant also continues to suffer from the years of stalking she endured. She claimed to always look over her shoulder and had moments of feeling unsafe. Also, Richard continued to reference her in his blog posts even after attacking Paige, and Ella had to provide evidence to the police as they built their case against him. Eventually, Ella received an indefinite non-harassment order that legally prohibited Richard from contacting her, monitoring her, or approaching her ever again. But a piece of paper can't erase years of trauma, and Ella knows that restraining orders don't always stop determined stalkers. The attack on Paige Rowland occurred on October 3, 2014, but Richard Britton wasn't arrested until November 2015, over a year later. When police finally caught up with him, Richard didn't even try to deny what he had done. He admitted to everything. On November 9, 2015, Richard appeared at Glasgow Sheriff Court and pleaded guilty to 2 separate charges. The first charge was assault with a bottle, causing severe injury to Paige Rowland. The second charge was stalking Ella Durant by engaging in a course of conduct that caused her fear and alarm. The evidence against Richard was overwhelming. The police had security footage from the Asda supermarket that clearly showed Richard attacking Paige. They had cell phone records that proved Richard had traveled from Bedford to Glenrothes on the day of the attack. They had Richard's blog posts where he confessed to stalking Ella for years, and they had Richard's own guilty plea admitting to both crimes. Richard's defense lawyer, Michael Meehan, tried to argue that Richard suffered from paranoid schizophrenia or personality disorder. The defense team explained that Richard's mental health issues had been so severe that he even had to sit exams alone in school because of his condition. They were trying to convince the court that Richard was a mentally ill man who needed treatment, not prison. But the judge wasn't convinced that mental illness excused Richard's actions. Before the sentencing, Richard made one last desperate attempt to show remorse. He contacted Paige through social media and sent her an apology message. It was a pathetic effort to make himself look better in front of the judge, but it was far too little, far too late. The damage had already been done, and nothing Richard said could undo the trauma he had inflicted on 2 innocent women. On December 17, 2015, Sheriff Martin Jones delivered Richard's sentence. The judge stated that the only disposal in this case is a custodial one, and sentenced Richard Britton to 30 months in prison. Richard was also given an indefinite non-harassment order that prevented him from electronically monitoring, communicating with, or approaching either Paige Rowland or Ella Durant for the rest of his life. Additionally, Richard would be subject to 1 year of community monitoring after his release from prison. In the end, Richard served 13 months in prison before being released in December 2016. Many people felt that the sentence was far too lenient, considering the severity of his crimes, but that was the decision the court made. Richard walked out of prison after just over a year, while his victims continued to live with the consequences of his actions every single day. What makes this case even more disturbing is that Richard Britton's attack on Paige Rowland happened during the same week as another high-profile incident involving an author targeting a reviewer. An author named Kathleen Hale had just made headlines for tracking down a Goodreads reviewer in real life after the reviewer left negative comments about her book. The fact that 2 separate authors engaged in this kind of behavior during the same week sent shockwaves through the literary community. Richard's case became part of a larger pattern of authors responding violently or inappropriately to negative reviews. It highlighted the very real dangers of online information sharing and the lack of privacy protection on social media. It demonstrated the serious risks that reviewers face when they share honest criticism of books. It raised important questions about mental health, obsession, and violence in the digital age. The publishing industry was forced to have difficult conversations about review culture and author behavior. Should authors be allowed to respond to negative reviews at all? How can reviewers protect themselves from unstable authors who might take criticism personally? What responsibility do platforms like Wattpad, Goodreads, and Amazon have to protect their users from harassment and violence? These were questions that nobody had good answers to, but Richard Britton's case made it clear that something needed to change. Today, Richard Britton's case is a cautionary tale in the writing community. It stands as an extreme example of author and reviewer conflicts spiraling out of control. Both Paige and Ella continue living with the psychological and emotional consequences of Richard's actions. They both had to uproot their lives, move to a new location, and live in constant fear that Richard might violate his order and come after them again. Meanwhile, Richard's books remain available online. In the world, Rose reviews on Goodreads and Amazon are overwhelmingly negative. Most are one-star reviews, darkly ironic considering a one-star review drove Richard to violence. Many reviews specifically mention Richard's attack as a warning. This case highlights the dangerous intersection of mental illness, obsession, and violence. Richard clearly needed professional help for his schizophrenia, but instead of seeking treatment, he allowed delusions and obsessions to consume him. He convinced himself that stalking was love, his book was beyond criticism, and violence was an acceptable response to a negative review. The case raises awareness about stalking behavior and warning signs that should never be ignored. It underscores the importance of online safety and privacy protection. Paige made the mistake of having her real name, hometown, and workplace visible on Facebook. Richard used that information to track her down and attack her. We must be extremely careful about what personal information we share online. Richard Britton destroyed multiple lives because he couldn't handle criticism. He went from celebrated countdown champion to convicted criminal because some people didn't like his book, because a teenage girl left an honest review saying she was disappointed. The next time you leave a review online, remember Paige Rolland. Remember, there are unstable people who take criticism far too personally, and your safety is more important than sharing your opinion. Protect your privacy. Be careful about what information you share on social media, and never underestimate what an obsessed person is capable of doing.